Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for letting me come and speak to you this afternoon. It's strange, I can hear myself. Kyle was telling me last time that I speak too softly. I'm sorry.
Whisper. No.
I am usually a soft-spoken person. Maybe next time I'll preach some hellfire and brimstone. No. Today, I would like to share with you some thoughts on Hebrews. Specifically, we'll look at Hebrews chapter 4, the last part of chapter 4, and getting into about the first half of chapter 5, Hebrews 4 and 5. So if you would like to keep up or follow along, that's where we're going to be, Hebrews 4 and 5. And hopefully, my goal this afternoon is to make the idea of Jesus more accessible. Sometimes we think about Jesus, or at least I do. This is a thing that I struggle with. We think of Jesus as this perfect being. Did I just lose the... Okay. We think of Jesus as this perfect being, and in our head, that kind of puts him in a place that is out of our reach, beyond our reach. It makes the idea of Christianity, the idea of following Jesus, impossible. How could I ever reach, or how could I ever attain to that example? Well, hopefully, after what we're going to look at today, hopefully we'll have a better idea of what that actually means for us as Christians. Here, let me get this going. We do this, and then we'll go like that, and ta-da, we've got it. There we go. Technology is great when it works. So, Hebrews chapter 4. The book of Hebrews, a little bit about the book of Hebrews. We are not sure who the author is exactly. I lean towards the idea that it's Paul, but we don't know definitively. There's some writing patterns that lean towards it was Paul, but there's also some unusual things about it. So we're not sure. But either way, the book of Hebrews was written to people who are very familiar with the old law, right? These are Jewish people who are very familiar with the structure of that old priesthood. And basically the theme throughout Hebrews is Jesus is better than anything that came before. The old priesthood had its purpose, but it was also flawed. And Jesus came and fulfilled the law and has become a permanent high priest who is better than any high priest who came before. So that's kind of the theme we're going to look at today. Let's go ahead and just read it. There's going to be 3 main points that I want you to consider as we read this. These points are: Jesus is the unchanging and permanent high priest, chosen by God. Number 2, Christ offered himself as the perfect sacrifice once and for all mankind throughout all history. And number 3, Jesus can empathize with us perfectly, and because of that, he can mediate between us and God perfectly. So let's read this. Hebrews chapter 4, starting in verse 14. And we'll go through chapter 5 and verse 10. It says there, I'll be reading from the ESV. It says, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' As he says also in another place, 'You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.' In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek." I think we're a couple slides behind. Yeah, here we go. So let's take a look first at this idea of Jesus being perfectly appointed. What does this mean? What this means, and if you noticed in the first part of chapter 5 there, it's making a comparison between the priests of the old law, under the Jewish law, and what their duties were, what it meant to offer sacrifices. And later on, it compares that to Jesus as a high priest. And what does that mean? What are the differences and how are they the same? And how is Jesus' appointment as high priest so much better? What does that mean? So under the old law, priests were temporary, right? They could only serve as long as they lived, right? Once the high priest died, well, then it passed on to another high priest. Under the old law, the priests came from the tribe of Levi. So this was a family lineage. And there were times throughout history that family lineage was broken. It stayed within the tribe of Levi, but it wasn't always under the same family. Is that a little loud? No? Okay. It's just me. So, in that sense, the priesthood is not perfect, right? There's still some instability. Can you imagine being part of the children of Israel, and every time the high priest changed to a new high priest? Like, what does this mean? If you can, it's not the same, but the easiest comparison I can make is here in America. Whenever we get a new president, there's always, oh, what does this mean? What does this mean as a citizen? It's similar. It's not the same, but it's similar. That idea of you get used to one person as your high priest, and now it's not that same person anymore. It's a new person. On the other hand, Jesus was appointed directly by God himself after the order of Melchizedek. And let's talk a little bit about this guy. There is very little known about Melchizedek. He's only mentioned one other time in Genesis chapter 14, verses 18 through 20. It says there, "And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." So who is this Melchizedek? What we know from these few verses is he was a king. He was a king of Salem, which later became Jerusalem. It's the same geographical area. And he was a priest of God Most High. Now, how is that possible? This is before the 12 tribes of Israel. This is before the nation of Israel. So there was no tribe of Levi. We don't know his genealogy. We don't know where he came from. So he didn't come from Levi. He wasn't appointed by men. And yet we see that he was a priest of God Most High. And a little bit of context of what Genesis 14 is talking about. Abram had just gone around and conquered a whole bunch of kings, and he was a very rich man. Abram had a lot of wealth. When he met Melchizedek after this conquering crusade, he gave Melchizedek a tenth of his spoils. So Abram, the father of the Israelites, recognized Melchizedek as a high priest, someone who had authority and power over him. And he gave him 10% of all that he had. So this is very unique. And the comparison here between Melchizedek and Jesus is very interesting. Jesus did not fit the lineage, the tribe of Levi, right? And his genealogy, well, he was born of a virgin. So, according to the old law, he couldn't have been a priest. But as we'll see later on, because of what Jesus did, the life that he lived, the sacrifice that he offered, God appointed him and designated him priest, high priest, after the order of Melchizedek. And after Jesus died and he rose again, he conquered death, there's no way that his lineage will end. He's sitting at the right hand of God. He is currently, and he will be forever our high priest. So there's no more turmoil. Oh, the high priest has changed. No, we know who he is. It's constant. And that should give us a sense of peace. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 7. We're going to bounce around a little bit in Hebrews. Hebrews is very, very, if you just read through it, it can be really confusing. And I hope that today, at least this portion will become easier to understand. Hebrews chapter 7, 23 through 24. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office, but he holds his priesthood permanently because he continues forever. So that's the idea of Jesus as our perfectly appointed high priest. Now let's take a look at this idea of sacrifices and the comparison there between the old law and the new law. What were these like? The sacrifices under the old law, as we read in Hebrews chapter 5, these priests had to offer sacrifices every single day. But not just that. Before the priest could offer a sacrifice for anybody else, he had to offer a sacrifice for himself. Now, why was that? Well, it's because he is not perfect. He makes mistakes too. He's just a man. The high priest is just a man. And before he can approach God to make atonement for anybody else, he first has to make sure that he is clean and holy before the Lord. So every single day, the high priest had to make sure to sacrifice for himself before he sacrificed for anybody else. How is this different from Jesus? Well, let's take a look. Before we get to that, let's look over at Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, and we'll read verses 1 through 4. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins? But in these sacrifices there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So that's under the old law. Let's look at the new law. Jesus offered himself as a perfect sacrifice once for all time and for all sin. The sacrifice Jesus gave on our behalf never needs to be repeated. Jesus' blood has paid in full our transgressions. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 7. Hebrews 7, 26 through 28. For it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered up himself. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever. So we see there, Jesus lived a holy and innocent, unstained, perfect life. And he was sacrificed on our behalf. He doesn't need to die again. He died once. He already did it. It's done. There's no need for daily sacrifices. It's done. It's finished. And I think that leads perfectly into what does that mean for us? And let's take a look at this idea of the perfect mediator and how that compares to the priests of the old law. In Hebrews chapter 5, like we read at the beginning, it talked about the idea of the priests under the old law had to give sin offerings for themselves daily. And this was a reminder to themselves that they had their own weaknesses. Now, what was that supposed to do? What that was supposed to do was to remind them, I am an imperfect human, and I can empathize with the rest of the people. We are all imperfect. I know how you feel. I understand your temptations because they're my temptations too. The high priest was supposed to relate to the people in that way. Now, how is this different from Jesus? Well, it's not much different. The idea that Jesus can empathize with us is, it's all over Scripture, right? Jesus came in the flesh. He lived a life just like us. And we read earlier that he was tempted in all points just like us. He understands what we're going through. And in that way, that helps me to understand when I'm being tempted, Jesus knows. He is the one that I can go to I can pray to Jesus. I can pray to God and say, I need some help. I'm weak. And he gets it. He understands because he's been through it. Let's take a look at a couple of verses here that talk about this. First in Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 8. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant. Being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Because Jesus came and lived in the flesh, and he suffered the same things that we suffer, he is able to communicate with God on a personal level on our behalf. Jesus can perfectly mediate between us and God in a way that no human priest ever could. Let's take a look at a couple more verses. Hebrews chapter 9, verses 15 through 17. Therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. And also Hebrews 7. We read this earlier, but it fits very well here. The former priests were many in number because they were prevented by death from continuing in office. But he holds this priesthood permanently because he continues forever. And here's the point. Consequently, he is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. So this point of Jesus, who is perfectly appointed as a high priest forever, and he knows our temptations, he knows our weaknesses, he can intercede on our behalf to God. That's powerful. That's grace. Jesus knows. He knows us. And he's not some God that's just waiting around to strike us down every time that we make a mistake. That's not the idea that we have at all. It's just the opposite. Jesus came and lived just like us, and he knows when we struggle, he can look and say, oh man, yeah, I know how that feels. I was there too. That affects me deeply. And honestly, it gives me a great sense of peace to know that I'm not alone, that God is not some lofty, too high to ever attain kind of God. Jesus brings us closer to God. Through his sacrifice, Jesus makes God accessible. Jesus is the source of our eternal salvation. Hebrews chapter 5, let's read this again. The last couple verses here, 7 through 9. And just remember everything we've talked about. Jesus is better than anyone who came before him. Read the book of Hebrews. It's incredible. And you will see this theme throughout. We can have peace knowing that Jesus is our advocate. He suffered through and felt the same pains that we do. And Jesus paid for our sins by offering himself as a perfect sacrifice. Let's read Hebrews 5, 7 through 9. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. And just like Brother Chester was saying, now is the time. This is the moment. This is the moment. We can have a relationship with God. And if you don't have that today, now is the time. There are so many men here who would love to help you. If you're struggling through something, if you're working through something, if you need the prayers, if you need some resources for help to become closer to God, or if you don't have a relationship with God, we would love to show you who Jesus is and how having a relationship with Jesus is life-changing. We would love to help you. Whatever your need, please let us know as we stand and sing.
Is the greatest